Yeah, it wasn't last. It wasn't last, isn't it?
No.
Okay. Brian, I think it should be up, and I just sent it to
You
you.
sent it? Okay.
I actually tweeted it.
Okay, so stream's back up and running. Matt Kane. You been every year to this?
I think I missed the first one.
Okay. All right. So he's almost every year. So, Matt, as many of you know, is editor of Hockey Graphs. He admits he was dumb enough to announce he was going to try his hand at curling analytics on Twitter, and no one let him off the hook for it. So here we are. Matt Kane, everyone.
Yeah, you really called me on my bluff here. Thanks, Ryan. Really excited to be here. The title of my talk is Hurry Smart, which I realize now that if not everyone knows, curling might not make a lot of sense. In curling, there's a lot of sweeping, if you don't know this, and people will yell hurry hard. So, yeah. Why curling? It wasn't just because I wanted to procrastinate working on contract model improvements, but it was like highly influenced by that when I was watching the Winter Olympics. This may have had something to do with it as well. And a little bit by this, I was having an argument with a friend about why freezing a rock, which I'll explain a little bit later, is always the right strategic move. And I kind of wanted to be able to prove that I was mathematically right, technically correct, the very best kind of correct. So we'll look at that a little later on. What is curling? Curling is a sport played on ice, beloved by dozens of Americans after the Olympic victory and approximately the entire population of Canada. The breakdown is roughly the same as research to the World Junior Hockey Championship. Curling is a drinking sport. I don't believe you're legally allowed in Canada to operate a curling club without a liquor license, or at the very least, that's based on the evidence of the curling clubs I've been to. Rules and terms. Each team has 4 players, a lead who throws first, a second, a third, and a skip who throws last. Teams and players alternate shots. Each player takes 2 shots in a round. A round is called an end. And teams play 10 ends in a game. If it's tied, you keep playing until someone scores. I'm hoping that everyone has at least seen what a curling rink looks like. And so the rings or the house is the scoring area. The stone has to be in the rings at the end of the end in order to score points. The button being the center of the rings, the closest you can be. The hammer is the last shot in a given end. It's decided either by coin toss or by a competition before the dash to shoot a single stone closest to the button. In subsequent ends after the first end, the hammer goes to the team that was scored against last. So if I start and I score, then my opponent gets the hammer. If they score, then I keep the hammer. If no one scores, then whoever has the hammer keeps it. A steal is scoring 1 or more points without the hammer. A blank is when no points are scored. And it's a little bit of a strategy as to when you choose to score. In terms of the shot types, a guard is a rock that you'll throw that will stop before the rings, and really it's meant to make it more difficult to shoot into the rings, perhaps to protect one of your own rocks. A draw, a softer shot that you're aiming to place it somewhere. A hit or a takeout, a harder shot that you're attempting to hit or take out another stone. A raise is hitting one stone back into the next. A freeze is placing a stone, my favorite shot, placing a stone directly in front of another stone so that if one stone hits yours, it'll just knock the other one back and yours won't go anymore. You can see why it's a great strategy. In-turn and out-turn are the direction that the shooter spins the shot. So for a right-handed shooter, an in-turn will rotate like this. for a right-handed shooter, an out turn will spin like this. This is my attempt to replace Michael's dancing. And the last thing is the 4 rock rule is basically a rule where you can't knock out one of the first 4 shots thrown as long as they're outside of the ring. The goal here is to put more rocks into play, which generally leads to more scoring and more exciting games. And the last piece of background before we'll actually talk about any analytics or statistics or whatever I'm presenting on, is the curling point system. And this is how we evaluate individual players. Each shot that they throw is scored on a 4-point system. 0 is the worst, you completely messed up. 4 is the best, you did exactly what you were trying to do. You can get partial points in between. At the end, usually you'll total up the points divided by the total possible points and say, he curled 86%, she curled 92%, that sort of thing. Higher, obviously better. This system, somewhat arbitrary, but we'll look at it a little bit later, whether it actually matters and whether these scores are indicative of play. In terms of data sources for this presentation, I had 2 places I went for this data. The first was Wikipedia, which had end-by-end results for the Canadian women's and men's championships back to around 1980, I think. And then the World Curling Federation website had play-by-play data for men's and women's Olympic and World Championships over the last 2 years, which was about 5 tournaments, 400-ish games, 8,000 ends, and 60,000 shots, which had the turn that was thrown, how many points the shooter was awarded, and what the aim of the shot was. So either a draw, hit, or a few other examples. So the objectives of this talk. Curling analytics are relatively non-existent. There is one person named Kevin Palmer who runs a blog called curlwithmath.blogspot.com. Well, it's probably just called Curl with Math. He's focused a lot on win probability and doing situational evaluations. So if you think you have a 40% chance of making a takeout versus an 80% chance of making a draw, what should you do given the score and the game and where you sit? So we're not going to go too much into that. We'll talk about it a little bit. But our aim is to use data to understand the flow of a game of curling, to use data to evaluate curling strategies, and to, as I mentioned, evaluate whether the curling scoring system even actually makes sense. We'll dive right into it. This presentation is a lot of graphs, so if you like colors, you're in for a treat. If you don't, then you're not. This is the average points scored by N throughout the game, and what you really see here, the key sort of trend to observe, is that scoring is a lot lower in the first 2 ends, and then it kind of reaches a stable point afterwards. A common strategy in curling is that you want to try to blank the first end if you have the hammer, so you want no points to be scored, with the goal that when you get into the second end, if you have the hammer at even ends and you just keep flipping it back and forth, you'll have the hammer at the end of the game, which is a really powerful position to be in because you'll have the last shot of the game and you'll know exactly what you need to do. So you do see that kind of play out in the data here where we're lower scoring early on, and then as teams start to need to get points and as the score establishes itself, it levels out a little bit. In terms of when steals occur, we see a really similar trend in terms of the game states, where the first and second end are maybe a little more cautious, and sort of a level trend throughout most of the game. And then at the end, the steal rate kind of skyrockets up to 33%. Some of this is definitely caused by the fact that in the 10th end, you kind of have to go for broke. And so if you have the hammer and you need to score 3 points, if you give up 1, it doesn't really matter. So if you exclude those sort of blowout games or games where the score isn't close, then the real steal rate in the 10th end is probably around 31%, but still considerably higher. So you can see that teams do have some impact on how aggressive they're playing throughout the game, and that changes. In terms of when blanks occur, very obviously it's a lot higher at the start of the game. In the first end, as I mentioned, there's that strategic aim there. Decreases throughout the game, and obviously at the very end, there's almost no point in blanking unless you're just trying to run up the game. Win probability. So this is empirical data from the Briar and the Heart, the Canadian Men's and Women's Championship, and it shows, based on the current score, what the probability that a team will win the game, will end up winning the game in a certain end, whether they have the hammer, which is the blue line, or if they don't have the hammer, which is the red line. So you can see starting out that the hammer is a tremendous advantage to have. Teams that have the hammer win about 57% of their games. We don't really have data on the results of that draw to the button competition that determines hammer, which may be one of the reasons that better teams are probably more likely to win that, and then they might be more likely to win. So that difference might not be the pure sort of home ice advantage, for lack of a better term, but it's probably pretty indicative of it. You can see that the value of the hammer in a tie game is relatively constant until about the 7th or 8th end, and then it gets a lot larger as you get towards the end of the game. The other thing to note is that getting up to is really valuable, and if you're up to with the hammer beyond basically the 5th or 6th end, you're over a 10% chance to win. So a question we can answer with this is blanking the first end actually a valuable strategy? And usually when you blank the first end, you're playing fairly cautiously. You're aiming to get out of that with no rocks in play. And when we look at the data, we see that it's not actually necessarily all that clear. If you look at taking 1 point versus taking 0 points, they're really close in win probabilities. So teams that scored 0 points and blanked the first end only did marginally better than teams that scored 1 point. Whereas if you played aggressively and really went to score 2 or more points, your win probability is a lot higher. So it may make a little bit of sense to play more aggressive in the first end, particularly because if you get off to that hot start, it really does make it difficult for your opponent to come back. Another strategic question that might be asked is, would you rather be up 1 without the hammer in the 10th end or tied with the hammer? And it's interesting here, one of the things Kevin Palmer talked about on his blog is about how curling is a battle for the hammer. You really want to control when and how you have the hammer. And you can see it in the stat here that you'd actually rather be tied going into the last end, even though the percentage of steals is significantly higher than you would be than up 1 without the hammer, where your opponent really gets to dominate the play. So the flip side of this, obviously, is that if you're in the 9th end and it's a tie game and you don't have the hammer, you really want to push to make sure that your opponent takes 1. Because if they take 1, you're in a much better position than if they retain the hammer and blank in. Next, we'll talk a little bit about score effects. A lot of you here probably know about score effects from hockey. They're a common phenomenon in many sports where the team that's leading tends to sit back while the team that's ahead tends to push to tie or take the lead. So a question you might ask is, do score effects exist in curling? The answer is yes. Teams that are leading tend to give up a lot more steals than teams that are trailing. And even within teams that are trailing, you do see that when you get way down, the steal rate tends to increase as well. So it could be that teams that are leading are really just playing cautiously. It could be that teams that are trailing know that they need to push for it. But the rate that steals occur obviously is heavily dependent on the score. As well, teams with the lead are more likely to blank in odd ends, which again kind of makes sense if you think of the theory of you want to have the hammer in the even ends, because that gives you in theory, the hammer at the end of the game. So if you're ahead and you're playing in an odd end and you can push it so that you've got the hammer in the even end, it's a relatively good strategy. And we see here that this is actually borne out in the data. That's really, other than the first end, the only time that there's a real difference between blank rates. We can also use some of this curling data to evaluate strategies. So early on in an end, teams have to decide whether to guard or to put a rock into the rings. And these are sort of various levels of aggressive play. And so you can see that particularly for the team without the hammer, which is shots 1 and 3, it's a fairly close to an even split in what they choose to do. And it does have a fairly big influence on how scoring occurs. So this is average points for and against based on what shot is thrown in the first 4 shots. So you can see that if you were taking the first shot and you throw a guard, you're likely to score slightly more points, but the average points against is also quite a bit higher. So it it may look like you're pushing your offensive advantage, but you really end up with a defensive liability there. Similarly, if you look at steal probability by shot selection, you see that by throwing a guard, you really increase the odds that you'll steal, which obviously, if you're down and without the hammer, that's likely to be one of your goals. Whereas for the team throwing shot two, the team with the hammer, who do not want to steal, throwing another guard actually might be the right play there as well, because the steal rate is lower. None of this includes sort of the interaction between shots, so whether it's draw or guard, which is something that is obviously a good sort of next step where we might want to work on. And then the last thing we can look at is multiple point probability. So if you're down in a game, what's the probability that you can score multiple points to come back and tie or take the lead based on what your shots are? And so again, we see sort of similar trends. If you throw a guard with your first shot, you're really opening yourself up to potentially allowing multiple points. Whereas if you're, particularly in the second shot, if you throw a draw, you're setting yourself up for maybe a slightly higher odds of scoring multiple points. So depending on what the score is and where the situation is and what you need to do, your choice of shot should really be influenced by how many points you need and what your opponent is attempting to do. So moving on to the curling point system, another thing that we can look at is the shot success rates by type. So in this, there's obviously a clear difference in how easy certain shots are. You see on the kind of the far right edge there, the easiest shots are a front, which is really just a guard where there's no stones in the house. Or a clearing, which is really just throwing a rock to knock it off another rock. And guards and takeouts tend to be easier because they don't really require you to necessarily keep your rocks where you don't really worry about what happens after you hit the rock. On the other end, something like a promotion takeout, which is a raise, is a lot riskier shot. A wick or a soft healing is really where you're trying to nick a rock and not knock it out, but knock it out of position. Which obviously, if anyone's drilled, is very difficult. So you can use this information in a few different ways, but the primary way is in conjunction with win probability data, where if you're evaluating whether to draw for one or to try and play a raise takeout for two, you can look at the probability of success plus your win probability gives you a guide as to what action you should take. We can also look at shot success rates by position. And then it's broken down a little bit between the team that takes the first shot versus the team that has the hammer. Obviously, if you're throwing the first shot at the end, you probably shouldn't mess that up all that often. And you see that they have the highest success rate. The lowest success rate is for the team with the hammer who throws last. Whether this is actually a reflection that they have more difficult shots or that they are less accurate or complete their shots or not, or that their mistakes are amplified in the scoring system and that they're treated more harshly by the judges when you miss the last shot of the end, which may result in your team giving up a steal or not getting as many points. There may be some score bias there, so there's probably a little bit more to look into if we had actual sort of XY data. So the last thing I want to touch on is, does a player's scoring matter? So one thing that you'll see on curling broadcasts a lot is whenever a player's shooting in a tournament, they'll say, the lead is shooting 95% on this tournament, or the third is shooting 84% and is having a rough go. So do these numbers actually mean anything, and are they indicative of team success? And so what I did was I ran a logistic regression at each position between players' individual game shot percentage, so how well they played in the game and the likelihood that their team won the game. And what you can see is that for the leads, for the first shot, it really doesn't have a significant impact how well the leads curl or not. And that's not to say that they're useless. They're probably brought on because they're excellent sweepers and they bring other aspects to the game. But when you're usually getting full points for that first shot, it's really difficult to have a huge impact, especially when there's so many more stones to be thrown. And then you can see as we go on between the second and third and the skip, that each of those players' success rates have a much more pronounced impact on the actual outcome of the game. So do they matter? Kind of, if you're a skip, it definitely matters. If you're a second, it probably matters less. And if you're a lead, then it really doesn't matter at all. In terms of next steps for curling analytics, one thing I'm hoping to look at is shot position data. The World Curling Federation for the last 2 or 3 years has been tracking the actual XY location of where all the stones end up after each stone is thrown. Unfortunately, this data is in images, so it's a little difficult to parse. But if you had that data, you could do things like look at expected points, you could build a win probability model, and you could probably create a better player evaluation system than just the 0 to 4 point scoring system, as well as I mentioned, examining shot sequences to better identify strategic considerations. So do you want to go guard draw or guard guard, and what impacts that have on expected points and win probability. And the last question, which I'm sure you're all curious of, is was I right about freezing? And the answer is no. Very disappointingly, freezes are fairly rare, or at least they were rare on the data set to be reported as a freeze, but teams that played at least one freeze won only 42% of the games, whereas teams that played 0 freezes won 53%. There may be issues with the data, so I'm going to go with that. Or it may be the teams that had to play the freeze are in tougher situations. But more to come on that. I'm confident that I'm right. And that's all I've got. Thanks.
All right, so last speaker in this session, Seth, if you want to come on down, get ready. Questions? Oh, man, go.
I got a question first.
Oh, there you
My question is, since you're kind of looking at both the binary of steal or not, score or not, versus the expected value of multiple points in the end, do you have any insight into which of those is relatively more important?
I think that looking at both is probably kind of it's not necessarily a flawed approach, but it's not the ideal approach, which would really be to look at the probability of each particular scoring outcome. So scoring 3 is a lot more valuable than scoring 2. And so that multiple points group is different than just, sort of the binary multiple points or not. It was a little easier to present that way and a little easier to model, but I think the sort of the true way you want to look at it is what is the actual impact on the probability of scoring each different, potential score outcome based on your action.
So you showed that lead does not have as much impact on the game just based on their absolute percentage. And you also showed that leads generally shoot the highest percentages. Could it be that they're just basing, like, good leads are canceling out good leads? And so then did you consider looking at lead versus opposition lead, second versus opposition second, to see, does lead in fact have a larger impact on victory if you can take advantage of having a better one than the opponent?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, is that the data that we're looking at is really the best curlers in the world. And so the number of leads who are throwing like 40% in a game is probably 0 or next to 0. But I do really like the idea of just comparing positional advantage to say, if you out second your opponent, how well do you perform that person? Yeah, exactly.
I share your intuition that freezing is almost always better than taking out. And I'm wondering, you didn't have any data from the mixed doubles, where I think freezing is much more common. So I wonder if there's just for strategic reasons, teams tend to not do it when they probably should be. But in the mixed doubles, they're doing it all the time. I was wondering if you thought that having that sort of data might change the way this works.
Yeah, that data is available. I didn't include it in the analysis just because obviously a different type of game, but it would be an interesting way to sort of test that out and vindicate myself.
Appreciate that.
One other question about the leads, Matt. Do you have any sense of what the distribution is of the scores on their shots for leads versus like skips? Is it the case that everybody sees a range, or is it leads are either a perfect score or a 0?
I don't actually know that, but I suspect that it's probably, I suspect that the number of leads who get less than a 4 on the first shot is probably very low. So it's probably a much tighter distribution than, or kind of binary versus the continuum that you see on for a skip. Thanks, everyone.
I'll leave it to you.
All right, so for next, thank you, Matt. Next speaker, we have Seth Partnow. Seth used to write at Nylon Calculus. Now he's the director of basketball research for Milwaukee Bucks. The first person with basketball background here, right, Matt? Yeah. And I lead all that in with the fact that he's not going to talk about basketball. So.
Thanks Ryan and Matt for having me. Like you said, I'm not going to actually talk that much about basketball. Jesse went one way with kind of proprietary information by turning the stream off. I'm going the other way, and I'm just not going to say anything about anything. I'm more interested in talking about and how we as analysts can impact the decisions. In many ways, I see my job as a communications job as much as it's a data job. I think that someone at Sloan this year, Horace McCracken, made the point that he doesn't work in data science. He doesn't do statistical analysis. He does baseball. And so communicating in basketball, in my case, is the most important thing I do. So that's why the title of my presentation is Impacting Decisions in Professional Sports for Fun and Profit, with the title. Oops. Anyway, a little story about me. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska. That's my kid. That's why you know about me. So the real question is, what are we doing here as analysts? I'll start that by answering the negative. What we are doing is proving our intellectual superiority to traditional sports types. Obviously, this is a hockey-centric conference, and there's perhaps more so than in most other sports, there's that tension between kind of the analysts and hockey man. And to get both from a credential standpoint, actually getting people to listen to us, and really from a level of knowledge standpoint, we're not here to prove we're smarter, we're here to make the team do things better. Relatedly, we're not disrupting entire industries. The people who have been doing this for a long time, more traditionally, are pretty good. Part of why the disputes get so contentious is that there's a lot of, especially in mature sports, hockey, basketball, football, other football, the level of knowledge gained over the intense study of it by people who devote their lives to it is pretty high. So we're not going to, except in very rare cases, we're not here to overturn decades and sometimes centuries of established practice. We're here to influence and kind of make better on the edges, kind of, as Ryan and Matt alluded to, or explicitly stated, incremental improvements are a pretty big deal. We're definitely not living a draft numbers life in professional sports. If anyone here who's worked with a team knows that actually the day-to-day isn't that glamorous. The hours are long, the travel sucks. And it's a lot of really hard work. So it's not a jet set lifestyle. So those are not the things we're doing. What we are doing is providing the best information possible to enable better decision making, ensuring more favorable long-term outcomes. That's a lot of words to say that we're essentially trying to do less wrong about things. So I've kind of boiled down how I like to impact decisions to three sort of general axes. As you can see up here, it's being selective and succinct in the topics you choose and how you present them. Worry more about overall accuracy than utter precision, and being humble in your presentation, in your level of knowledge, but confident that what you know, and have done the work to prove that it is correct. I'm going to start on the first one. I'm going to play a little bit of a video, kind of illustrating, I think, setting out a little bit why being selective and succinct is important. This is one of our games from last year, and our color analyst, Steve Novak, a former NBA player, is discussing kind of the amount of information available. It's specifically in a sports science and medical context, but I think it applies just as well, if not greater, to kind of more performance data that we tend to be used to looking at.
Yeah, I think that there's obviously.
Can people hear that?
Research and guys are like single movement, how they're affecting what they're operating, all this information. I think it's so important.
Oh. Sorry.
That information be understood and used by the medical staff, but the players don't become overwhelmed with that information. I think it's the guy's job to go out there and play as hard as they can for as long as they can. There are so many people on staff, the medical staff, that can help make those decisions, maximize what these players are able to do and put them in the best positions. But I think burdening the player a lot of times with that information can cloud their mind and make them think I'm tired when I'm not, or I need more rest when I don't. So I think there's a very interesting discussion as to how it's used and how meaningful all that stuff is.
So if you could hear what Steve was saying there, it's basically, I think a lot of people describe it as an information funnel. You have to be very careful what actually gets to the player so that in the moment they can make the correct decision kind of without thinking about it. And there's very few players, very few people really who can take on this kind of information, a great deal of this information, and make it actionable in the moment. So you have to start with the broad set of data that we have, even in sports like such as lacrosse, where there isn't great reams of existing data. That's still a ton of information that Jesse has pulled out. And if you just gave that in raw form to a player, either they wouldn't be able to use it, or they'd be thinking about it and paralyzed in the moment. And just as an example of kind of this in a basketball context, just the number of sources of data we have. We've got Basketball Reference, we've got NBA Wowie, we've got NBA.com, I'm now Calculus, right guys, ESPN, and Cleaning the Glass, Ben Falk's site, and all of these sources have a great amount of information. You can't just take it all, throw it on a piece of paper, hand it to someone and say, do with it what you will. So in more specific terms, I'm a recovering lawyer, so anyone who's law school, bar prep, understand the call to question. There's a great tendency to want to, someone asks you a question, here's everything I know, all at once. That's information overload. People, if you guide them and have a discussion with people, they'll tell you what they want to know. They may not necessarily know what specific stat to ask for, but in the context of the sport you're working in my case, in basketball, someone will ask me about a player's offensive rebound. I don't need to tell them, or more specifically, for example, who are the most aggressive offensive rebounders. It's not a time for me to go on a 20-minute discourse about everything that I can tell statistically about rebounding. It's focusing on that particular piece of information. Number two, recognizing the decision-making context. Am I talking to a coach? Am I talking to a scout? Am I talking to a general manager about a player personnel decision? The presentation and what I present will be vary greatly based on how the person is going to use the information. And this is related to the first one, give them what they ask for and no more, know when to stop. However, be prepared to give more, because if you do your job well and develop trust over a period of time, interest will be piqued, and you have to be ready to tell me more, tell me why. what if you're wrong? You have to be prepared to answer all those questions, even if that's not what you're going to lead with. Point number 2 is talking about accuracy over precision. There's the saying that all models are wrong, some are useful. So precision is kind of an illusion anyway. And in many cases, kind of solving to the third decimal place gives both a false impression of precision and can overwhelm the decision maker who doesn't know, okay, there's a 43% chance of rain, what do I do with that? So while this is an anecdote that Ravi Ramanetti, the director of analytics for the Seattle Sounders, gave it at Sloan a couple of years ago, just a specific example. But a couple of years ago, he developed a big old model, tons of inputs that he thought did a pretty good job of projecting when a player, if I believe they played 90 minutes, was likely to sustain a soft tissue injury. So it's something you tell a coach, this player has a 32% chance of getting injured if he plays 90 minutes tonight. The natural response from a coach is that a lot? What does that mean? And so kind of in a very painful way, since we worked really hard to derive that 32.4% number, maybe a better way to display it is stop play. It's a risk, it's not certain, but it's definitely not an all clear. Again, you definitely sacrifice some accuracy, some precision in terms of, but you're broadly accurate in terms of this player is in a risky state. Consider whether playing him is worth it based on the importance of the game, how likely we are to defeat the opponent with him, without him, things like that, which the coach is likely in a better situation to evaluate. And third main point is being humble yet confident. I think this is very important as analysts. We are coming in, generally speaking, as outsiders. I have a basketball playing background. Do not have an NBA basketball playing background. So that naturally puts me at a kind of a deficit in terms of kind of assumed understanding of everything. And I would say rightly so. So we need to come in and recognize and respect the subject matter expertise of people who have played, coached, observed the game over a lifetime. And especially at the professional level, they've done things that have earned them that spot. So that those things are worthy of respect. Relatedly, these people have been studying it their whole life. The level of understanding of the game is very high. You reach a very high bar to something to actually improve on present practice in most areas. There's some low-hanging fruit, fourth down aggression and stuff like that in football. Kind of, generally speaking, how early to employ an underdog strategy is probably the main area of where that isn't true. But rather than, it's typically thought in public discourse that if you're going to rate the level of understanding of the pros on a 0 to 100 scale, on Twitter, people seem to think it's about 50. In actuality, it's an 80 or 90. You have to be very good with your analysis, reach a high level of understanding to do something that's better than kind of what the tried and tested methods that have worked over many years. Third thing is to question your own results first. A lot of times, I think everyone's probably had this experience where you assemble your data, you construct a model with decent theoretical underpinnings, you run the model, you run the analysis, and something completely counter to conventional wisdom is the result. The natural kind of impetus is to want to run out and say, wait, I've discovered something new, change everything we're doing. But that really should be is a strong blinking red light to you, wait, what have I done wrong? Because that's the first question you're going to get asked anyway, and second of all, you may discover holes in your data that way. I guess the most salient example to me when I think about basketball is in play-by-play data, there's sometimes categorization of shot types. We've talked about hockey a little bit, but in basketball, you can say, guy made a 17-foot fadeaway jumper, a 13-foot bank shot, so on and so forth. Oftentimes these are cited as, wow, this guy shoots 75% on bank shots. If that was the case, they should always shoot a bank shot since they shoot 50% on all shots. However, what actually happens when you examine the data is that those kind of flavor descriptors are more often put into the play-by-play data on made shots than on missed shots. Partially because it's more descriptive. I think it's also just a matter of time for the scorekeeper. But if a shot is made, there's kind of a pause as the team takes the ball out of bounds and inbounds goes up the other way. Whereas on a missed shot, if the shot is missed, it's rebounded, we're going to get away. There's a lot more that's happening that a scorekeeper has to keep track of. So maybe adding that flavor isn't possible at the moment. What that means is that relying on that data would lead you to a conclusion that is completely counter to reality. And the last point about humility is just remembering that causality is hard. There's so many things in sports. It's a very complex system where it's just almost a never-ending series of chicken and egg problems where is the team performing better because of what this player is doing, how he's performing, or is the player performing that way because the team is better at a high level? So just remember keeping those things in mind. However, you've done the work, know what you can prove, what you know and what you think to be true, and be clear about where those things lie. You're almost putting a stoplight on your own analysis by saying, okay, this is green. I'm certain of this. I can prove it with data. I've considered the counterfactual. I've examined my methods. I've thought about why I'm wrong, and I'm to a 99% confidence know that I'm right. Other things, I know this to be true. I can't quite prove it to the extent where I'm willing to stand on the table and shout it. There's other things where I sort of suspect this is my opinion, take it what you will. Second thing about the confidence is, you're going to lose a lot of arguments just because the statistical analysis portion is only one aspect of something that goes into a decision. It's not time to get discouraged. It's a positive that you were able to take the first shot, so be ready to take the next shot. Argue with the same confidence, the same passion you did the first time, and be egoless about whether your suggestion is accepted, because again, it's just one part of many variables that go into a given decision. And the third thing is don't really beat yourself up if your suggestion is implemented and it goes the other way. A lot of these things are probabilistic. Most of these things are probabilistic. If you recommend something that's 70-30, that means 3 times out of 10, it's going to go against you. Now be willing to examine whether you were actually right or if maybe you missed on something. But if you give a recommendation and the actual result in the one trial you have goes against you, don't give up about if you get a question on it. Say, no, I was right, do it again the next time. It'll work out for us in the long run. And final word, that this is kind of an overarching thing. Oftentimes people, when they're presenting this information, like to say the numbers prove, the numbers indicate. The numbers themselves don't say anything. As an analyst, you're responsible for interpreting those numbers. If it was easy, if it was objective, they wouldn't need you. So it's not just the numbers say, you say. So there's 2 things going on there. One is taking responsibility for your opinion, but also knowing that you know more about the sport than what's merely in the numbers. So you've already given some interpretation to why a given stat is important. And last thing, just before we get to the questions, I just want to get out of the way. No, I can't talk about that for obvious reasons. I'm very interested in player value metrics in other sports, just not basketball. And for Danny, Die Hard is definitely a Christmas movie. I'm sorry. Let me say, I kind of ripped through that, so I think we'll leave time for questions.
Yes. All right, questions for Seth? All right.
Hi, thanks. So you mentioned that analysis has a high bar to clear,
Yes.
right? But there's many decision areas, right, within an organization. What are the lowest bars right now that analysts can make the most impact?
That gets me dangerously close, so I can't talk about that territory. I think generally speaking, it's areas where either there's been the least thought sort of put in already, or where the answer is going to be most objective. I think, again, I mentioned kind of the underdog strategy, like that's sort of empirical facts that, you know, going 4 up, 4th down at the 4 is better than nothing. Like that's now whether that can defeat kind of the ingrained prejudice of the sport, that's a whole other thing. But that's that kind of breaking through those barriers. I think a different topic, probably a different discipline almost of psychology.
Do you have any advice or intuition about when bringing a particular piece of information to an athlete might be not worth it? For instance, with regards to, like Matt was talking about, in curling, there's a lot of specific situations where you have time to think about it and you know whether or not to do a specific type of shot. Whereas, like, say you're in baseball and you're saying you're not hitting your low and away, pitches very well, or in basketball you're saying you're not going well to your left. Those are more about the player's individual reflex at the moment that you kind of have to real life hack to get into how they would change their behavior, as opposed to a very individual event style like something in curling. Should you be more hesitant bringing something to a player that they have to really put a lot of practice into to change what they're doing, or do you have any intuition on whether or not that's worth paying attention to?
At least in my experience, like at the professional level of basketball, if I never talk to a player about any of this stuff directly, that's fine. That's probably desirable. Filtering it through kind of a coach or video analyst is probably better because I can readily identify kind of the what and maybe the why, but it's not. It's almost certainly not my job to influence the how they go about fixing it. The other part of that is I think it probably what if you're in a situation where you are making those kind of suggestions. I think there's a difference between kind of discrete sports like I say curling and baseball, where it's kind of stop start. You step out of the batter's box, think about it, kind of thing, and kind of a more continuous sport like basketball, soccer, hockey, where kind of that those any kind of conscious thought while you're playing can really get in the way. It's really important to simplify and make it a very simple, like, see, do heuristic than kind of calling on higher order intellectualizing of it for the vast majority of players, I'd say.
So Seth, what parts of hockey are you most curious about, or do you think the most about, or that you find just the most interesting?
I kind of the passing and network effects stuff, and I'm also just I'm super fascinated for when and if the tracking data comes, what it reveals about how the game is played. I think the sports of hockey and basketball actually have a lot of kind of structural overlap. And so seeing how hockey people kind of dealt with some of those issues in the absence of the data that I'm lucky to have, gives some good ideas in terms of analyzing basketball, and I played hockey growing up too, so I'm just kind of, I'm always interested in figuring out kind of how it works.
Do you work as a team on roster management and player acquisition type stuff? And if so, kind of how does that impact compared to kind of in-game strategy and coaching and things like that?
Again, that borders on, I can't talk about it, but I think it's actually, roster and cap management, player acquisition stuff, that's probably an easier way in most cases, because those processes have already been kind of statistically based. We're just kind of using different newer statistics and modeling techniques. So I mean, you borrow whatever the sport, you've already looked at, like, the back of the baseball card stats as part of the way of evaluating a guy. And now in many ways, part of the analysis is just using more refined tools to get at a player's impact in a way that, kind of a basic slash line in baseball might not. And that's not to say that it can have great impacts in both. I think it's just almost an easier sell in the first one, just because it's more familiar.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It's great to hear about how teams collaborate and analysts collaborate with their colleagues on teams. I work in a research area called computer-supported collaboration. Can you speak a little bit about how technology is changing the way you work with your colleagues, whether it's the coaches or the performance staff or the players or the front office?
I mean, I think the single biggest way is trying to get us to kill fewer trees. Moving as far away from kind of paper reports as possible, doing stuff app-based, which both is more portable and allows for kind of better representations of how things work than kind of flat tables and visuals and things that are more interactive and visually arresting, which is, how pretty something is matters a great deal in terms of how well it's received.
When you're working with either it's a coaching staff or maybe someone who isn't as familiar with some of the more advanced data, how do you find is the best way to communicate something to them? Is it by using visuals? Is it by combining it with video, maybe simplifying it with examples? What's the best way of communicating a complicated idea and turning it into something simple that someone can understand?
I'd say the single most important thing is the answer has to be the language of the sport. You can't, if someone is asking me about rebounding, I have to tell them about rebounding. Now, I might use some metrics that I then explain and tie back to rebounding, but I have to give an answer in a context and a framework that they're used to dealing with. I mean, if we're talking about a guy's, I come up with stats about like rebounding aggression. You talk about in terms of crashing boards. Which is how, it's how a coach would speak about it, how a television analyst would speak about it. So basically taking my concepts and metrics and turning them into familiar what are you really being asked? And not burdening that with kind of extraneous detail.
Okay, thank you, Seth. All right, so we are about to break for lunch, correct, Matt?
Yep, we're about to bring for lunch. Pizza is out in the atrium. So I think the schedule has us starting back up around 1:20. Well, I think,
Yeah.
Here, let's say 1:15.
Go eat.
I will die on that.
Hey, I got here late, so I didn't get a chance to
Oh,
pay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, what's your name?
Tyler.
Hi, great.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no problem. I'm a student, so it should only be $5, right?
You only have 20.
Yeah.
Where are you a student?
U of R.
Okay. We'll take this back.